everyone, and welcome to this month's RELO Andy's webinar. I am Rachel Martin, and I am so glad you are here. I'm so glad to see people joining us live, and I also want to say a special welcome to anyone who's watching the recording of this later. So you've probably found the webinar here on the RELO Andy's Facebook page. I want to take a moment and invite you to make sure you're following the page so that you know when webinars come up and lots of other training and resources as well. So RELO Andy's is the Regional English Language Office from the U.S. Embassy in Lima, Peru. And just so you're marking it on your calendar here, we have a monthly webinar for teachers on the third Thursday of every month, unless there was a major holiday, I guess. But next month, that's going to be happening on December 16th. So I'm glad you're here today, and I look forward to seeing you back then. So please write in the chat. We'd love to hear where in the world you're joining us from. Looks like we have Sylvia from Paraguay. Great. I don't know who else might be here, so I can see the chat, and I really do look forward to having you here. So make sure you are commenting and we'll get you up on screen here. All right, so today's goal in our half hour or so that we have here today, we are going to borrow 4 lessons from the field of project management and apply them to teaching English. Hi, Edison in Ecuador. Good to have you here this month again. Welcome back. Let me just start off by asking another question. So maybe you're already answering or you're still answering where you're joining us from. Can you throw into the chat as well? Do you know anyone who is a project manager? It isn't the most common profession, but I know a couple of them. I have a couple of them in my life. Hi, Hernandez from Venezuela. Great to have you here. Does anyone know someone who is a project manager? Maybe it gives you an idea of what that means, what they do. What do they do? Well, as you're answering that question, let me answer my own question and say, what does a project manager do? So there's a lot of definitions, and Roger there is on to something, saying we make projects in class. We do. We have a lot of projects, and we're going to talk about how we can kind of think of them in this way, how it might help us be a little bit more efficient, maybe a little less stressed as English language teachers. So there's a lot of definitions. Like I said, there's several professional organizations for project managers, but I like this one here. And I'm going to go ahead and read it because I know there are quite a few words on the screen there. So project managers are responsible for planning, organizing, and directing the completion of specific projects for an organization while ensuring those projects are on time, on budget, and within scope. Whoa, that's a lot of words. Let me highlight some of my favorite words on this. So we have the verbs. You know, I always highlight the verbs. We're talking about planning, organizing, and directing. Okay, as teachers, we do all of that, right? We plan, we organize, and we want to say directing. Often we're encouraging students to do things. We're directing our students along. Specific projects, okay. As teachers, we do have pretty defined specific projects, specific goals that we need to accomplish, that our students need to accomplish. And it says the project manager needs to make sure that these projects are on time. Okay, that's always huge for us as teachers, you know, trying to finish what we need to finish before the end of the term. On budget, oftentimes our budget is 0. 0 is still a budget. And within scope. Within scope really kind of means we're sticking to our scope and sequence. We're sticking to what should be covered in the class or what our students need to know oftentimes before they go on to the next class. So I'm going to say that a lot of these tasks that a project manager does, we also do as English teachers. Of course, there are also some big differences because a professional project manager is usually outside the work that's taking place. And, you know, we're inside it. We're doing the teaching. So we have to think about this in a different way. But let's start by thinking about what projects are you currently working on? So Roger mentioned that we do a lot of projects in class, and I think that's true. But let's start naming some of them. So you can put some in the chat if you'd like, or I'll share some here. When you plan a unit, completing that unit is a project. And getting all the materials together, creating the slides, creating whatever you need for that, that's a project. When you have to finish your grades and get them all submitted at a certain time. I used to have 70 plus students at one time, and all the grades were due the same week. That was a busy week, always. It was like a 5-page report card. I'll never forget those report cards. That was a project. Perhaps our students are working on projects, whether we're doing project-based learning or they just need to accomplish something. Maybe you're working on a project related to professional development. Edison says he's writing his autobiography. That's definitely a project there. Maybe that's a blend of a personal project and professional development. Who knows? Maybe right now we're getting midway through November, getting to the end of November. Maybe you're planning an end of the year celebration, or you're working on some sort of materials in general. Maybe you have a project or you've been given a project, whether you chose it or you were assigned, that you need to be communicating with families. Or, of course, there's countless administrative tasks. So I hope I've established that, as a teacher, we're working on a lot of projects. How can we kind of think about some of these differently? Well, I have a vocabulary word for you. I'm going to have 2 new vocabulary words in here that are related to project management. And the first one is deliverable. So let me give you the fancy definition here from Investopedia first. A deliverable is a quantifiable good or service that must be provided upon the completion of a project. Okay, let me put that in my words now. A deliverable is the specific things that you make or do to complete a project. When I'm done with this project, here's what's actually happened, what's been accomplished, and what I'm giving to someone or that I have given as part of it. So student materials, those could be a deliverable. Maybe you needed to make student homework packets or design a new quiz. That would be a deliverable. If you are a teacher trainer and you need to give 6 different workshops, those 6 workshops could be your deliverable. Oh, there's a great example there. Making a city map to learn the prepositions of place and to give directions. That map, when it's done, and this might be a deliverable for your students more so than for you. They have to do this and they have to be able to turn it in. So this is something we want to keep in mind. A project has to end with a deliverable. Maybe we can even define our projects and start to break them down based on what's the specific thing we're making or doing in this time frame. Okay. We'll come to the second vocabulary word in just a moment, but I want to give you kind of an overview of where we're going today. So I said there'd be 4 lessons from project management, and here they are right here. To identify and serve your stakeholders, that'll be our second vocabulary word. To have clear outcomes, to break down your project into steps, and to have a clear communication plan. All right, so easier said than done. Let's jump in and talk about the first one, which is to identify and serve your stakeholders. Okay, so this leads to the question, what is a stakeholder? This is not a word we use commonly in English unless you are maybe in the business world or you're a project manager already. Maybe if you've been writing grants. A stakeholder is the people or groups who have something to gain or something to lose from your project outcome. So it's really the people, or by people, we can also mean an organization, the people that are going to gain something or lose something, depending on how this project goes. They're invested. They have a stake in the outcome. That's where stakeholder comes from. So let me ask a question here. And anytime you see this little logo up here with my person on their laptop or typing on their phone, this is the logo that means it's time to put something in the chat. So if you're watching live, I'd really like to see you answer this question in the chat. If you're watching this on repeat, go ahead and answer there too. Who are the stakeholders in your class. So stakeholders are people who have something to gain or something to lose. While you're thinking of your answer, and thank you, Roger, for putting one in the chat there. While you're thinking of your answers, let me show you some pictures I think might jog your memory or inspire you here. So two of our biggest groups of stakeholders that come to mind right away are students and their families. So exactly what you were just saying there. Parents are a major stakeholder in their kids' education. They have something to gain or something to lose based on how that goes. The students themselves, of course, are as stakeholders. Let's see, who else? Well, I put this up here to thank, admin, administrators, the school, whoever you're working for as an organization. They have something to gain or something to lose, depending on how your projects and how that education is going. We can also say policymakers, whoever's setting the education policy that you're following. They have a stake in whether that succeeds or fails or how people react to it. Exactly what you just said there about government decisions. We can also say society in general. I mean, this is getting a little abstract because they're not really in my classroom every day. They're not in your classroom, but how education functions impacts all of society. And perhaps the most forgotten stakeholder in a classroom is you, the teacher. Remember what I was saying earlier, when we're teaching, you're involved in the process. You're not just an outside project manager watching to make sure it stays on track. Whether the class is successful, depending on how the project goes, you're going to be impacted by that outcome too. So make sure you consider yourself a stakeholder in your own class. Now, what does it mean to consider your stakeholders? I said you have to identify them. And, depending on where you teach, those stakeholders might be different. So we said families, but if you're teaching adults at a university or a technical school, maybe their families are much less involved. Perhaps depending on where you teach, the only stakeholder that you can really adjust for might be your head of school, your principal, your administrator. How much freedom you have to identify and respond to stakeholders might depend on if you're nombrado, if you're tenured. But once you know who those stakeholders are, here's 3 questions that I think are really helpful. We need to ask, what do the stakeholders really want? So what do the students want to get out of the class? What did their parents want them to get out of the class? What does the educational policy want them to get out of the class? How do you know that answer? And this one, I think, is the great one. Sometimes we give our students surveys. Sometimes we give our students an opportunity to give us feedback. How could we think of possibly expanding that? How do we know what the parents want? How do we know what the admin wants? I mean, usually they tell you in a series of email, but how do we check in? And most importantly, when did we last check on these answers? Because what a student wanted in March might be really different than what the student stakeholder wants in November. Stakeholders can adjust what's important to them. So as teachers who want to apply some of these project management ideas, it's really important that we keep adjusting and we keep checking in from time to time. All right, so we're going to move into our second one here. And the second lesson that we're borrowing right out of the project management playbook is to have clear outcomes. Now, I think this is something we focus on a lot as teachers anyway, so we'll just do a really quick review here. Okay, this is our put it in the chat icon, so I'd like to hear from you. I'm going to give you 4 choices in just a moment, and I'd like to ask, which of the following is a clear outcome, okay? So which of these 4? Is it A? These are all great goals for teachers. Let me put that up there. These are all great goals, or they could turn into projects maybe, but only one of them has a clear outcome in mind. So the first one, I will keep in contact with students and their families. That's A. Or B, I will ask students what they think of the class. C, I will reflect on my teaching. Or D, I will call students' families each week and I will call 10 students' families each week and keep a list of who I have contacted on my Google Drive. Okay, like I said, all of these are great goals for teachers, maybe, but only one of them is a really clear outcome. Which one do you think? Let's see your answers in the chat here. Okay, so I think there's one, and maybe in this case it was a little bit obvious because it was the longest, but Gabby has it right here. D, I will call 10 students' families each week and keep a list of who I have contacted on Google Drive. Let's look for just a moment at what are the elements. What makes this a really clear outcome, okay? So we have an action. What was the action? I'm going to call, okay? Then we have how many. How many students are you going to call for this outcome? Or how many students' families are you going to call? If we don't know how many, we don't know when to stop. We don't know if it's been successful or not. The next element is the timing. A project always needs to have a timeline or an ending point, or at least a point where you're checking in. So when we say each week, maybe we could have even been more specific and said by Friday of each week. I don't know when your week ends, but at least we have a timing here. So we know how often do you need to call 10 students' families. Now this next one, this is another thing that I think we can really borrow out of project management. In project management, there is a lot of documentation. It's really important to keep track of what has been done so that you know what the next step is or if there's been a problem along the way. So in order for this to be a clear outcome, we need to make sure that we're keeping a list or you're documenting it somehow. So how will it be documented? And kind of as an add-on, where will it be documented? All right, so we had all of those elements in this clear outcome. And let's apply them now, okay? I'm going to put up one of the other choices from that little quiz, one that was less clear, and let's fix it, okay? So this was a great goal for teachers. I will reflect on my teaching. I think teachers who reflect have much better outcomes. But how can we make this a clear outcome, okay? So I'd like to see some of your ideas here. Can we add in what? Well, maybe we have the action because we have I will reflect. So we have our action, but how much reflection? How long should you spend reflecting? How often or by what date? We could say how often or by what date. And how will you document this? So I'd really like to see a few of your answers here in the chat. Maybe I can share some ideas too, because in order for us to make this a project or for us to keep track of if we are on track, these are the questions we need to ask. Exactly how many, by what date, the documentation is such a big thing. So maybe if you were going to reflect on your teaching, maybe you're someone who likes to do it by journaling. So you could document that by actually writing something down. And depending on your teaching style, your preferences with technology, that might be, something you keep, I wouldn't say on a public blog, but, privately on your computer, on your phone. It could be something you write. That could be your how for documenting. Let's work it backwards. By what date? Do you want to reflect once a month? Do you want to reflect at the end of the unit when you have all of your students' tests? Do you want to reflect every day? If you have a lot of time, you can just, maybe you don't even need a lot of time. Just write down a sentence or two about how a lesson went. That would be our by what date. You need to pick that for yourself. And then how much or how many? I just kind of gave an example without meaning to. I said, maybe you write 2 sentences about how a lesson went. Or if you're reflecting after a whole unit, maybe you sit down and you write for 10 minutes. There isn't a wrong answer. We just need to make sure we have answers to these questions. All right, we're going to jump into our third lesson that we are borrowing from project management. And the third one here is to break your project down into steps. So this is important for our students, and I think we kind of instinctively do this for our students, although it's definitely a skill we can refine. What do they need to do first? If students are going to write a summary, what do they need to be able to do first? What do they need to learn? If they're going to write a little book report or give a speech, what's the first step? What's the second step? We're pretty good about thinking about those things. But what about for our projects? Okay, so if I need to prepare 20 report cards by Saturday, what are the steps for me? Okay, well, I'm going to need to go gather some of my notes. I'm going to need to set aside a time when I have my computer. What are the different steps? This was from a workshop that I was doing with teachers a couple months back, and they were using a Jamboard to break down a project into steps. So let me make this a little bit bigger on the screen so you can take a better look at this. The idea for this particular project was you were breaking down the different skills. So this was skills more so than steps. But the outcome, the very clear outcome here, was that students will present for 1 minute about what they did last weekend. So just that short oral presentation in class. I mean, I think we do that all the time. Well, here's prerequisite skills. Here are the skills that the teacher was thinking to teach. And then this one was like right on the edge. So maybe some of the students would know it, some of the students wouldn't, depending on the level. You might need to do a little bit of, pre-assessment. But think about this. For a 1 minute presentation, we don't usually instinctively think of it including, 9 different steps. But it could. And it's worth, maybe not on every project because we don't have the time, but once in a while or on the bigger projects or when you've set aside some dedicated planning time to really break it down into every single step. And then just because you've put it on the list, I mean, maybe your students already know it, and that's great. And you can even highlight that when you're introducing the project. You can say, you guys know how to do that, and that's a confidence builder for them. Or when you break it down into steps, sometimes you discover something you've overlooked, or it seems like, oh, of course, they're in the 3rd class of English, they should know this. And you realize, yikes, that hasn't been taught yet. So you have to make some adjustments to the plan. Here's just another example from that same group when I was working with teachers when we were coaching this skill of breaking down a project. And so this is that same 1 minute oral presentation, but this person broke it down into different skills and different steps. So it may be a matter of how you think about it. Sometimes this can be really interesting to ask your students to break it down and see what they consider the steps of a project to be. That's definitely changed how I have taught a few units when I asked my students, what do you need to accomplish this? And sometimes they know, sometimes they overlook it, but it is just another perspective. Of course, another strategy to get this perspective is if you break a project down into its steps, into the mini tasks and the skills that are needed. If you have another teacher who's teaching the same level, maybe they can do the same, and then you compare notes. And I recommend you do this completely separately because like I just showed you, this was one person's interpretation of the steps. This was another person. So by looking at 2 different interpretations, we can get a better idea. You can get a better idea of what's involved in the task. Yes. Oh, and I do like that, Edison, that this can be part of challenging the assumption that the teacher is the only person who can set up the guidelines. Exactly. We're co-creating knowledge with our students. And if we look at it from kind of a project management perspective, if your students are the ones that are supposed to accomplish the task, if they're the ones that have to actually do the project, then you're kind of looking in from the outside. You're making sure they have what they need to be successful. You're trying to keep them, on time, on budget, and on scope. Well, we need to make sure that we know what they're accomplishing to know if they're on time, on budget, and on scope. All right, we've moved through 3 of the 4 lessons that I wanted to cover today. Let's come up to that 4th one. And the 4th one is to have a clear communication plan. And if I had to break down the elements of a clear communication plan, it's going to sound pretty familiar. Who are you talking to? How often are you talking? How are you talking? And did you document it? This is going to sound very repetitive. So let me ask you, Think about it for a moment. Who do you as a teacher need to communicate with every week, each and every week? Who do you need to be talking to? And again, this answer is going to look different depending on where you teach. How old are your students? How many students do you have? I can put my pictures up here for all the stakeholders again. Do you need to talk to the students every week? I'm going to guess the answer is yes. Do you need to talk to families every week? Maybe, maybe not. Again, that depends on the age and the setup of the school. There have been places I've worked where we sent home a whole newsletter every week talking about what we were doing. There are other places where that might not have happened. Do you need to be communicating with your administration or your leadership every week? If you feel like you need that guidance, or if you do need that guidance, are they initiating it? Is it only a one-way like information to you? Or how often do you need to be talking to your coordinators? Is that weekly? Is that monthly? Is that once a term? Everyone's needs are different, but once you've assessed how often does this need to happen, then you can come up with a plan for it. I kind of put society and policymakers down here in the corner because we're probably not talking to them on a regular basis. That's usually, mediated through someone else. But just like Jimmy mentioned down here, our colleagues at school are, that's someone that I actually should have put up here. I don't have other teachers on this slide, and that's a hugely valuable group of people that we should probably be communicating with. Again, how often? Do you have a grade level team? Do you have weekly meetings? What's the method? How often? And how is it being documented? All right, so we're going to wrap up here, but I want to kind of review and give you some ideas for next steps. So the 4 lessons that we were borrowing this month from the field of project management include identify and serve your stakeholders. Do you remember who those stakeholders are? That's a brand new vocabulary term. Have clear outcomes. And the clear outcomes include how often, how something's happening, and how you're documenting it in addition to the action itself. Number 3 is to break your project down into steps. And occasionally go crazy. Break it down to as many mini steps as possible. You can always combine them or restructure it later. But if possible, ask your students to be involved in identifying what those steps are, or work with a colleague who has a similar project and can help you identify what are all the steps. Make sure you're not skipping something. And finally, have a clear communication plan. That clear communication plan will include those same elements of how often, how are you communicating, and how are you documenting it? Now, if you found this topic to be pretty interesting, which it's not my field, but it's one that I think I've gained a lot from over the years. So I'm always looking for new resources in. I'm always trying to take some professional development in. Let me give you some suggestions for next steps. So step 1, the thing I think everyone can do if you're watching this webinar, I want you to think for yourself, what are some of the projects that you are currently involved in? Go back to the idea of deliverables. What's something you're making or doing over a specific period of time that has a specific outcome? Once you start thinking about your work in terms of projects, definable projects, it's going to change how you approach it. If you want to talk more about this, we're going to have a discussion group tomorrow, and I'll give you the details in just a moment. There's also a lot of articles out there on the topic of project management, and there are some free MOOCs. So a MOOC is, of course, a massive open online course. There's one, for example, I think it's on edX. If you look for Introduction to Project Management, you can find some free training resources that, are always a little bit of extra English listening practice if you find them in English. And finally, if you want a next step to explore this, focus on the documentation side. Come up with a tracking system that works for you. Project managers love their tracking software. Some of them are out there free. Maybe you just need to draw something on a paper, but keeping track of where your project is, what stage it's in, is key to thinking like a project manager. All right, so I mentioned this discussion group, and I want to make sure you know when and where and how on this as well. So, tomorrow in 24 hours, we will be holding a discussion group on this topic. Come hang out. We always have a nice little chat every month. To sign up for this, you'll head over to the RELO Andes Facebook page. In about 10 minutes, there'll be a link posted there. You have to sign up in the Google form, and then we will send you the link to join. All right, so I want to open it up for questions here. And we've had a really participatory group this time. So thank you for being here, those of you that have been live. And again, if you're watching this on repeat, you can still come to the discussion group if you see it in the next 24 hours. Or we just had a question here about how to receive invitations to the next webinars. I want to remind you that these webinars are free and open to all English teachers, and they're held on the third Thursday of the month. So if you want to make sure that you're at the next webinar, make sure you're following the RELO Andes Facebook page. Maybe go like something, or the fact that you're writing comments will help. Make sure you just check back so you don't miss it. We'll be back here again next month. All right. Thank you so much. I will see you then.